Welcome back, everyone, to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you turn to these stories as a soothing escape, a gentle bridge into rest. So before you drift off tonight, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always incredible to see how far this sleepy little community stretches across the globe. If you haven't already, be sure to tap that subscribe button so you never miss one of our nightly crime stories. And if tonight's tale resonates with you, consider giving this video a thumbs up. It truly helps more than you know. Now, let the soft rhythm of rain set the mood as we open the pages of a haunting tale, one that begins quietly, like the first drops on a windowpane, then spirals into a series of chilling events etched into the annals of true crime. So, get comfortable. Let the rain carry your thoughts. And let's drift gently into the mystery. Story 1. The tragic case of Corey Brewer, a 97-year-old woman who died in the snow. Police say it wasn't an accident, but a family betrayal. It was an ordinary winter evening in a small, serene community where the hush of snow falling was as familiar as a beating heart. Corey Brewer, a 97-year-old woman, lived a life that many would envy, surrounded by family and the echoes of countless memories. For nearly a century, she had borne witness to the world's changes, celebrating life's joys and enduring its sorrows. A mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, she had become the unshakable pillar of her family, a symbol of resilience and love, even as time stole away her physical strength. On that particular evening, the world outside was cloaked in a quiet white stillness. The streets lay undisturbed, the trees wore their winter coats, and the only sounds were the occasional whistle of the wind and the soft creak of settling snow. Inside her home, one might imagine Corey seated by the window, perhaps reminiscing about her younger days, the laughter of loved ones filling her mind, even as the hours ticked by toward nightfall. But as the evening turned to night, something shifted. When family members realized Corey was missing, a sense of unease settled in. Where could she have gone? At 97 years old, she moved carefully, dependent on her walker and the occasional helping hand. A quick search of the house led to a startling discovery: her walker and her phone were still there. Outside, the temperature had plummeted. The snow showed no signs of her presence. And yet, Corey was gone. Panic set in as a search was launched. Neighbors joined the effort, their flashlights cutting through the frosty darkness. The community, once quiet and serene, buzzed with activity as people called out her name, their breath visible in the cold night air. Hours passed before the search ended in heartbreak. Corey's lifeless body was found lying in the snow, a solitary figure surrounded by the frozen silence. At first glance, it seemed to be a tragic accident. Perhaps she had wandered out in a moment of confusion. Perhaps the cold had claimed her before help could arrive. For a woman of her age, the elements could be unforgiving. And yet, as the details began to emerge, the tragedy deepened. Something about the scene didn't feel right, something was missing. The questions began to pile up. Why would Corey leave the warmth of her home without her walker? Why hadn't she called for help if her phone was within reach? And why did it feel as though her disappearance wasn't entirely unexpected? As investigators pieced together the story of Corey's final hours, the focus shifted. It wasn't nature that had claimed her life. It wasn't mere misfortune that had left her body in the snow. The truth, when it began to take shape, pointed somewhere far closer to home, closer than anyone dared to imagine. Corey Brewer's death was no accident. It was something far more unsettling, a betrayal by the very people she trusted most. Her family. For a community that had revered her as a symbol of love and unity, the revelation was almost too much to bear. How could this happen? How could a family, bound by love and loyalty, fracture in such a devastating way? And, most hauntingly, how could someone look into the eyes of a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother, and leave her to face the bitter cold alone? Corey Brewer's story is not just a tale of loss, it's a story that forces us to confront the darker corners of human nature, where love and loyalty collide with greed, anger, and neglect. It's a story that demands answers, not only for her but for every vulnerable person who places their trust in the hands of family. This is her story. A life lived with grace and an ending shrouded in betrayal. A tragedy etched into the snow, and a search for justice that continues to this day. Corey Brewer's life was a patchwork quilt of memories, stitched together by nearly a century of experiences. Born in an era when the world was simpler but harsher, she carried the wisdom of someone who had seen wars come and go, technology reshape lives, and families grow and splinter across generations. Corey embodied resilience. She had lived through the Great Depression, raised children during uncertain times, and adapted to the ever-changing world with grace and quiet strength. In her later years, the weight of time began to show, as it does for us all. Her once sharp mind started to cloud, her memory sometimes faltering in ways that were as subtle as they were heartbreaking. Friends and neighbors often described her as warm and kind, but also fiercely independent, a trait that hadn't dimmed with age. Yet, like many elderly individuals, Corey's independence came at a cost. As her physical health declined, she grew increasingly reliant on those around her, particularly her family. To the outside world, Corey seemed surrounded by love and care. Her family, a sprawling network of children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren, appeared deeply devoted. They visited her home, helped her with daily tasks, and reassured her that she would never be left alone in times of need. It was a bond built on decades of shared history, and Corey trusted them implicitly. In their presence, she felt safe. But behind the scenes, there were cracks in the foundation of this seemingly perfect family dynamic. Unspoken tensions lingered, small disagreements simmering quietly under the surface. These moments, however fleeting, were easily brushed aside during family gatherings, overshadowed by laughter and memories. Corey, always the matriarch, rarely spoke of these rifts. She chose to believe in the goodness of her family, in the strength of their shared connection. As her cognitive abilities began to decline, her vulnerability grew. Forgetting where she had placed her glasses, struggling to recall the details of conversations, or even mistaking one day for another became more common. At times, she would express frustration with herself, but her family would quickly reassure her, offering gentle reminders and warm smiles. Despite these challenges, Corey remained deeply aware of her surroundings. She was still the same woman who had weathered the storms of life, even if her steps were slower and her thoughts sometimes tangled. The winter of her 97th year arrived like any other, blanketing her small town in snow and forcing most residents indoors. For Corey, the season was both a source of beauty and a reminder of her limitations. The icy sidewalks and biting cold meant that even short walks had to be postponed, and she found herself spending more time inside, relying on family visits to break the monotony. She spoke often of her gratitude for the love and support she received, marveling at the kindness of her grandchildren and the bonds she believed would never falter. Yet, in the days leading up to her disappearance, there were subtle signs that something was amiss. Corey, who had always been meticulous about her routines, seemed more forgetful than usual. She misplaced small items, grew confused about the time of day, and mentioned fleeting feelings of unease, though she quickly dismissed them, waving away any concerns with a soft chuckle. Her family, too, seemed preoccupied. There were moments when their visits felt hurried, their conversations shorter, as though they were distracted by matters she couldn't quite discern. The last time Corey was seen alive, she was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered world she loved so dearly. Her walker rested nearby, her phone within reach. To anyone passing by, it would have been an image of quiet contentment, a woman at peace with her surroundings. But this tranquil scene would soon shatter, leaving a void that no amount of time could fill. The events that led to her disappearance remain clouded in mystery. What was it that drove Corey to leave the safety of her home on that fateful night? Did she step outside willingly, or was she coerced? The answers to these questions lie buried within the hearts of those closest to her, hearts that may not be as innocent as they appeared. The night Corey Brewer disappeared began as quietly as any other. The wind howled softly outside, carrying with it the chill of midwinter, while snowflakes drifted down in slow, rhythmic cascades. Corey, alone in her home, would have had no reason to venture into the frigid night. Her walker remained by her favorite armchair, her phone resting undisturbed nearby. And yet, when morning arrived, her absence was unmissable. The alarm was first raised by family members who came to check on her. They found the house in an eerie state of stillness, no sign of a struggle, no footprints in the freshly fallen snow outside. At first, confusion reigned. Perhaps she had been picked up by someone, an assumption quickly dismissed when her walker and phone were found untouched. These were lifelines Corey never went without. The thought of her stepping outside without them, especially at her age and in such brutal weather, seemed unthinkable. Within hours, concern turned to panic. Calls were made, neighbors notified, and a search began to take shape. Small groups spread out through the streets and wooded areas, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness as night fell once more. The air was thick with desperation as they called her name, the sound muffled by the snow. Each passing minute stretched endlessly, the cold biting harder with every breath. Meanwhile, the police began their own search, retracing her final known movements. They combed through her home and interviewed family members. The picture they painted was of a vulnerable woman, dependent on those around her. This vulnerability added urgency to the search. For Corey, even the smallest misstep outside could be catastrophic in the freezing conditions. It wasn't until the early hours of the following morning that the search came to a devastating end. A group of volunteers stumbled upon her body lying in the snow, a haunting image that none of them would soon forget. She was dressed in a thin coat, entirely inadequate for the sub-zero temperatures. Her walker and phone were nowhere to be found, and there were no signs of a struggle or an attempt to protect herself from the cold. The scene was quiet, almost peaceful, but its implications were far from it. The discovery raised more questions than answers. How had Corey ended up outside? Why was she dressed so lightly in weather that could claim a life in minutes? The absence of her walker suggested she hadn't left the house of her own volition. It was simply impossible for her to move unaided. As investigators examined the area, they found no evidence of a vehicle or other means of transportation. The snow surrounding her was undisturbed, as if she had simply materialized in the spot where her body was found. An autopsy was conducted, and its findings cast an even darker shadow over the tragedy. Corey had succumbed to hypothermia, the bitter cold shutting down her body one organ at a time. But beyond this, the pathologists noted troubling inconsistencies. There were no signs of physical trauma, but subtle details in her clothing and the way she was positioned suggested she had been placed in the snow deliberately. The lack of defensive injuries or evidence of resistance pointed to the possibility that Corey had been incapacitated in some way before being left outside. The investigation shifted focus. What had initially seemed like a heartbreaking accident was now being treated as a potential homicide. Suspicion began to circle closer to home as police questioned family members about the hours leading up to her disappearance. A troubling narrative began to emerge, pieced together from fragments of testimony and subtle inconsistencies in their accounts. Corey's family, once the picture of unity and care, was now under scrutiny. Investigators learned of disputes over her care and, more disturbingly, over her assets. As a woman of nearly 100 years, Corey had accumulated a modest estate, enough to spark tension among those who should have been her protectors. These revelations cast a chilling light on her final moments. Had she been lured outside under false pretenses? Had someone close to her, someone she trusted, made the calculated decision to leave her to the mercy of the elements? The idea was almost too horrifying to contemplate, but the evidence could not be ignored. Corey Brewer's death was not simply the result of a tragic accident. It was something far more calculated, and far more chilling, a betrayal by those who were supposed to shield her from harm. In the days following Corey Brewer's tragic death, the snow-covered town found itself grappling with a bitter reality. The image of the frail 97-year-old left to die in the freezing cold lingered in every corner, casting a shadow over a community once defined by its quiet harmony. Law enforcement, spurred by the troubling details of the scene, launched a meticulous investigation to uncover the truth. The case was no longer just a personal tragedy, it was a potential crime. Detectives began their inquiry with those closest to Corey, her family. What initially seemed like a formality, a routine set of interviews with grieving relatives, soon revealed an undercurrent of tension that could not be ignored. As officers pieced together timelines and statements, subtle discrepancies began to emerge. Questions that should have had simple answers, who had last seen her, who had called her that evening, were met with hesitation or conflicting accounts. Corey's grandson, who had always been vocal about his love and admiration for her, appeared deeply shaken in his initial interview. "She was the glue that held us together," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't understand how this happened. She trusted all of us, we were supposed to protect her." Yet, when pressed on the events leading up to her disappearance, he offered little clarity, stating only that he had last spoken to her briefly a few days before the incident. He insisted that everything had seemed normal. Her granddaughter's testimony added a different layer to the narrative. Known for her closeness to Corey, she described frequent visits to her grandmother's home and shared warm memories of their time together. "She was sharp in ways that surprised me for her age," she explained. "Sure, she forgot little things sometimes, but she was still her. She was still Grandma." But when asked about the family's dynamics, her tone shifted. There were disagreements, she admitted reluctantly. "Small things, mostly about her care. But I never thought it would come to this." These admissions raised questions about the family's internal relationships. Investigators learned of disputes over who should be responsible for Corey's day-to-day care, as well as conflicts regarding her modest estate. While no single argument seemed severe enough to suggest foul play, the cumulative effect painted a picture of a family under strain, grappling with the weight of responsibility and the complications of inheritance. It was a dynamic familiar to many, yet in this case, its consequences were tragic. Meanwhile, law enforcement turned their attention to physical evidence. The autopsy had already revealed inconsistencies that pointed toward foul play, and further examination of the scene added to their suspicions. Snow patterns around Corey's body suggested she had been placed in her final position rather than collapsing naturally. The absence of her walker and phone, both of which were critical to her mobility and safety, further supported the theory that her death was no accident. As detectives followed the trail of clues, the community watched with bated breath. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of secrets kept behind closed doors, of motives hidden beneath grief-stricken faces. Corey's neighbors, many of whom had known her for decades, struggled to reconcile the image of her loving family with the emerging details. Was it possible that someone so close to her, someone who had shared holidays and celebrations, could have been responsible for such an act? The weight of these questions fell heaviest on Corey's grandson and granddaughter, who emerged as vocal advocates for justice. At a candlelight vigil held in her honor, her grandson addressed the gathering with raw emotion. "This is not just about my grandmother," he declared, his voice trembling but resolute. "This is about accountability. About making sure that no one else has to endure what she did. We will not stop until we have answers." His words, though powerful, hinted at a deeper pain, an unspoken acknowledgement of the fractures within the family he so desperately wanted to protect. Her granddaughter echoed these sentiments in a later interview, her composure masking the turmoil beneath. "We owe it to her," she said firmly. "Grandma gave everything to this family. She deserved better. Whoever is responsible needs to be held accountable, no matter how hard that truth might be to face." Her statement, though pointed, left room for interpretation. Was it a call for justice directed outward, or an acknowledgement that the answers might lie uncomfortably close to home? As the investigation continued, law enforcement remained tight-lipped about potential suspects or motives. The lack of concrete evidence made it challenging to move forward, yet the circumstantial details painted an increasingly troubling picture. The case became a test of patience and resolve, for both the police and the family. Every unanswered question, every moment of uncertainty, only deepened the sense of betrayal that hung over Corey's memory. In the end, the investigation was as much about uncovering the truth as it was about confronting the complexities of human relationships. Corey Brewer's death was more than a single event, it was the result of choices, tensions, and fractures that had been years in the making. And as her family awaited closure, the community braced itself for the possibility that justice, when it arrived, might bring with it more pain than relief. As weeks turned into months, the case of Corey Brewer remained open but unresolved, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease that stretched across her family and community. Law enforcement, while diligently pursuing leads, found themselves caught in a web of circumstantial evidence and unanswered questions. Despite the troubling implications of the autopsy and the inconsistencies in family members' statements, no charges had been filed. The investigation continued, but progress was slow, weighed down by the complexity of uncovering the truth in a case that struck so painfully close to home. For Corey's family, the absence of closure was its own kind of torment. The public nature of the case had placed them under intense scrutiny, with whispers and speculation swirling around their every move. The grandson who had once spoken so passionately about seeking accountability grew quieter with each passing interview, his initial determination tempered by the toll of constant questioning and the realization that answers might remain elusive. The granddaughter, too, seemed to bear the weight of the family's fractures, her once firm resolve now softened by a sadness she struggled to conceal. Amid this silence, the community began to grapple with the broader significance of what had happened. Corey Brewer was not just a victim of a single, tragic event, she had become a symbol of something far larger, far more universal. Her death forced difficult conversations about the treatment of the elderly, the vulnerabilities they face, and the responsibilities borne by those who care for them. Elder abuse, a term that encompasses neglect, financial exploitation, and outright harm, is a reality faced by millions of vulnerable individuals around the world. In many cases, it goes unnoticed, hidden behind closed doors or dismissed as the unfortunate byproduct of stress or strained relationships. Yet, Corey's story refused to be hidden. It brought the issue into stark focus, reminding everyone that betrayal is most devastating when it comes from those we trust the most. In Corey's case, the betrayal extended beyond her family. It was a failure of the systems meant to protect her. How had a woman so clearly vulnerable, so evidently in need of support, been left in a position where such a tragedy could occur? Neighbors began to question whether they could have done more, whether there were signs they had missed. For law enforcement, the case became a chilling reminder of the importance of vigilance, of not allowing suspicions to be dismissed too easily. At the same time, the unresolved nature of the case created a vacuum of accountability. Without formal charges, the family's statements remained just that, statements, untested by the scrutiny of a courtroom. This lack of resolution only deepened the rift among Corey's relatives, as unspoken accusations and lingering doubts festered. Relationships that had once been held together by her presence now seemed irreparably fractured, each member grappling with their own version of the truth. For those watching from the outside, the story became a mirror, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable realities of their own lives and relationships. How do we care for the most vulnerable among us? What unspoken tensions might we harbor within our own families? And what would we do if faced with a situation as heartbreaking as Corey's? As the investigation continued, Corey's grandson issued one final public statement, his voice carrying a mix of hope and resignation. "My grandmother didn't deserve this," he said. "And we don't deserve to live without knowing the truth. I still believe we'll get justice, but it's not just about us. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else. We need to do better, for her, and for everyone like her." His words, though poignant, captured the profound uncertainty that defined the family's journey forward. Her granddaughter, too, chose to speak out one last time. In a televised interview, she reflected on the lessons learned from her grandmother's life and death. "Grandma taught me what it means to be strong, to face the world with grace no matter what it throws at you," she said. "I don't know how she would feel about what's happened to us, but I know one thing: she would want us to come together, not fall apart. And she would want the truth to come out, whatever it may be." The story of Corey Brewer leaves us with more questions than answers. The investigation remains active, a slow-moving pursuit of justice that may take months or even years to reach its conclusion. In the meantime, her story serves as a wake-up call, a reminder that the bonds of family, while often our greatest source of strength, can also be fragile and fraught with tension. It asks us to examine how we treat those who depend on us, to reflect on the ways we can protect and uplift the vulnerable, and to recognize that betrayal is not just an individual failing but a collective one. For those watching, the legacy of Corey Brewer is a call to action. Share your thoughts. Reflect on her story. Discuss how we can prevent tragedies like hers from happening again. In the end, her life was more than her death, a testament to resilience, love, and the importance of never turning a blind eye. Story 2. Texas teen who confessed to murdering high school track star, then asked police if he could claim self-defense. Imagine a young athlete at the peak of his abilities, a high school track star destined for glory, his future bright, his aspirations limitless. He's admired by peers, celebrated by coaches, and perhaps envied by competitors. On the surface, life seems perfect, a seamless rhythm of practice, competition, and triumph. But on one fateful evening, everything changes. That rhythm, once steady, is interrupted, not by a misstep on the track or a fleeting injury, but by something that would reverberate far beyond the confines of a stadium. This story unfolds in Texas, a place where values run deep, traditions are fiercely held, and community is a cornerstone. The backdrop? A high school athletic meet, filled with cheering crowds, the thundering applause of proud families, and the smell of freshly cut grass mingling with the electric energy of competition. It was here that two paths intersected, those of Carmelo Anthony, a teenager whose story was just beginning, and Austin Metcalf, the celebrated track star whose story came to an abrupt and tragic halt. But how could a meeting between two individuals, seemingly ordinary in every sense, turn into an event that would leave investigators, families, and the community in disbelief? How could a confrontation, so brief yet so charged, escalate into violence that would end one life and redefine another? By the time the authorities arrived, the tension had already reached its boiling point. Witnesses stood frozen, the air thick with shock and questions no one was prepared to answer. And there he stood, Carmelo Anthony. His words were calm, deliberate, and chillingly matter-of-fact. "I did it. I was protecting myself." What followed was a confession that seemed to raise more questions than it answered, a claim of self-defense amidst a tragedy that begged the question, what really happened? Was it an act of survival, a split-second decision that anyone might make under the right circumstances? Or were there forces at play that no one had seen coming, forces that had been quietly simmering until they erupted in the most unimaginable way? Excitement was in the air. The track meet was in full swing, a community event that brought families, friends, and athletes together. In the stands, parents were lined up, some balancing foam coffee cups in one hand while gripping tightly onto camera phones with the other, ready to capture every fleeting moment of their kids' races. Younger siblings were chasing each other up and down the bleachers, blissfully unaware of the competitive spirit that ruled the evening. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, calling out names and events, while bursts of cheers erupted periodically as races came to a photo finish. The track field itself was a flurry of activity. Athletes in bright jerseys stretched and warmed up, their eyes locked on distant horizons as they mentally prepared for the challenge ahead. Groups of teammates stood huddled together, some joking to ease their nerves, others offering each other quiet words of encouragement. Coaches were pacing along the sidelines, stopwatches in hand, yelling last-minute strategies to their runners before ushering them to the starting line. It was a scene of energy and ambition, one that repeated itself in countless high schools across the country, but on this night, Kuykendall Stadium would bear witness to something that no one could have expected. Among the athletes shining under the glow of the stadium lights, none stood out more than Austin Metcalf. He was the star of the evening, a name known far beyond the boundaries of his high school. Austin was everything you'd picture when you think of a young athlete at the height of their game, confident, driven, and undeniably talented. At just 18 years old, Austin had already achieved what many could only dream of. He was a senior in high school, a track star whose performances consistently set records. Whether it was the 400-meter dash or the grueling long-distance events, Austin dominated them all. His reputation wasn't just built on his speed, it was his unyielding dedication that people admired. Teammates spoke of how he'd be the first to arrive at practice and the last to leave, always pushing himself harder, always striving for that extra inch, that extra second. But it wasn't just his athleticism that made Austin stand out. Teachers praised his discipline and work ethic in the classroom, while friends described him as someone who had a natural ability to lift others up. For his family, he was the golden child, the pride of every dinner conversation and holiday gathering. Scholarships were lining up, scouts were calling, and it seemed like Austin Metcalf was destined for greatness. And then, there was Carmelo Anthony. Carmelo's presence at the track meet couldn't have been more different from Austin's. Where Austin thrived in the spotlight, Carmelo stayed firmly in the background. At 17 years old, Carmelo was a quieter figure, one who often seemed to fade into the periphery. He didn't have the medals or the recognition, but those who knew him would say there was something complex about him, something beneath the surface that was hard to pin down. Unlike Austin, Carmelo didn't exude confidence or charisma. He was reserved, often described as someone who kept to himself. His relationships with peers were distant, his interactions with teammates polite but minimal. Some said he carried the weight of personal challenges that few could understand. Others simply didn't notice him at all. That night, as Austin prepared for what would be another winning performance, Carmelo lingered on the edges of the field. Quiet. Observant. Alone. The meet went on as planned, a string of events unfolding with predictable rhythms, the pop of the starting gun, the steady pounding of feet on the track, the roar of the crowd as another runner crossed the finish line. For most, it was just another evening of competition. But for others, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when something felt off. Carmelo's demeanor hadn't gone unnoticed. Some of the parents in the stands remarked that he seemed unusually restless that night. He wasn't competing, yet he was there, pacing near the track with his hands buried deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the athletes. Austin, too, seemed different, not in a way that was immediately obvious, but in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. There were moments when his trademark smile faded, when his attention wandered despite the camaraderie of his teammates. At one point, he was seen looking over his shoulder, as though searching for something, or someone. The tension between the two, though invisible to most, was undeniable. They were like two parallel lines destined to meet. As the night wore on and the final events approached, their paths finally intersected. What happened next would change everything. The evening had stretched into its final moments. The crowd, once alive with thunderous cheers and applause, had grown quieter as families began to pack their belongings and athletes retreated to locker rooms. The track field was emptying slowly, but the atmosphere remained charged, as though something unseen was holding everyone's attention. Austin Metcalf, fresh from his last race, stood near the field with his teammates. His hair was damp from sweat, his face still glowing from the thrill of competition. Conversations buzzed around him as his peers discussed the events of the night, congratulating him on his latest victory. But Austin wasn't fully present in these moments. He looked distracted, his eyes darting across the field, searching for something, or perhaps someone. Carmelo Anthony hadn't left the sidelines. He lingered, his presence almost unnoticed amid the dwindling crowd. He was quiet, standing alone with his hands tucked into his pockets, watching the scene unfold with a fixed intensity. To those who had seen him that night, Carmelo seemed unsettled, his stance rigid, his eyes unwavering. Witnesses would later recount seeing Carmelo approach Austin, though the exact details of the interaction remain murky. Some say it was Austin who initiated the conversation, while others insist that Carmelo made the first move. What is known for certain is that their exchange grew heated quickly. Eyewitnesses described the scene in fragments. One parent recalled hearing raised voices near the edge of the field, though the words were indistinct against the hum of the stadium. An athlete nearby claimed that Austin gestured angrily, his expression shifting from confusion to frustration in a matter of seconds. Others painted a more vivid picture, Carmelo standing firm, his tone low and deliberate, while Austin seemed to tower over him, his stance challenging. The tension between them, palpable and unrelenting, escalated with each passing moment. Then, in an instant, everything changed. The confrontation reached its peak, and before anyone could intervene, Carmelo made his move. Witnesses reported seeing the flash of a knife, the unmistakable glint of steel under the stadium lights. Gasps and screams erupted from the sidelines as people rushed toward the scene, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Austin fell, clutching his side, his white jersey blooming with crimson. The bright lights of the stadium bore down on him as he collapsed to the ground, surrounded by teammates and spectators. Chaos ensued as phones were pulled out, calls made to 911, and desperate attempts to help the injured track star began. As the chaos of the evening unfolded, police were quick to arrive at Kuykendall Stadium, responding to frantic calls about the stabbing. By the time they reached the scene, paramedics were attending to Austin Metcalf, whose condition was gravely critical. The once vibrant stadium had turned into a tense, somber tableau, onlookers frozen in shock, the metallic wail of sirens cutting through the night. Carmelo Anthony, standing nearby, didn't make any attempt to flee. Officers approached him cautiously, prepared for resistance, but it never came. His demeanor was eerily calm, almost detached, as he delivered his confession, "I did it. I was protecting myself." The investigation began with the collection of evidence at the scene. The knife used in the stabbing, a small but sharp blade, was found on the ground, its handle smeared with blood. Officers documented every detail meticulously, the placement of the knife, the angle of Austin's fall, the expressions of the witnesses. These elements would later become crucial in piecing together what had happened. Eyewitness accounts provided initial clarity but were far from consistent. Some described the argument between Carmelo and Austin as heated, with raised voices and aggressive gestures. Others claimed Austin was the one who appeared to confront Carmelo, his tone sharp and challenging. And then there were those who maintained they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual until the moment of the stabbing. The probable cause affidavit, filed shortly after the incident, detailed the sequence of events as pieced together by detectives. According to the document, Austin had approached Carmelo with what witnesses described as hostile intent. However, the affidavit also noted the lack of physical evidence to suggest Austin had posed an immediate threat, a factor that would complicate Carmelo's self-defense claim. Further examination revealed that the knife belonged to Carmelo, raising questions about whether he had brought it to the track meet intentionally. This discovery led investigators down a troubling path. Was the act premeditated, or had Carmelo simply been carrying the knife for personal safety? Forensics played a critical role in the investigation. Blood spatter analysis confirmed the angle of the stabbing, suggesting that Austin was standing when the knife struck his side. The autopsy would later reveal the depth and trajectory of the wound, confirming that it had been delivered with considerable force. Carmelo's claim of self-defense became the focal point of the investigation, and of public discourse. According to his statement, Austin had confronted him in a manner that left him feeling threatened, and the stabbing was an act of survival. But this assertion was met with skepticism from detectives, legal experts, and the community. Under Texas law, self-defense is justified only if the individual reasonably believes they are in imminent danger of serious harm. To substantiate his claim, Carmelo would need to prove that Austin's actions posed an immediate threat, a task made challenging by the lack of physical evidence supporting this narrative. Prosecutors, however, challenged this narrative at every turn. They pointed to the text messages, the possession of the knife, and the forensic evidence, arguing that Carmelo had planned his actions long before the confrontation occurred. An eyewitness told police that Metcalf asked Anthony to move out from under the tent that had been set up for members of his high school track team on the field that day. Anthony then reached into his bag according to the eyewitness, and told Metcalf, "Touch me and see what happens." The eyewitness said Metcalf touched Anthony, at which time Anthony allegedly told him to punch him and see what happens, according to the affidavit. Metcalf then went to physically move Anthony, which is when Anthony allegedly pulled a knife out of his bag, stabbed Metcalf in the chest, and fled from the tent, according to the eyewitness. The entire altercation lasted less than 30 seconds, according to the affidavit, and multiple eyewitnesses backed up this version of events. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, the gravity of the moment palpable in every corner. Carmelo Anthony, the teenager whose actions had set these events into motion, stood before the judge, his expression unreadable. The case had been long and arduous, a legal battle that sought to unravel not just the facts, but the intentions, emotions, and context behind them. The decision was not a simple one. The jury had deliberated for hours, sifting through conflicting testimonies, forensic evidence, and legal arguments that painted two vastly different pictures of what had happened on that tragic night. On one hand, the prosecution had argued that Carmelo acted with intent, bringing the knife to the track meet with the knowledge that he might use it. On the other hand, the defense maintained that his actions were those of a frightened teenager, backed into a corner and forced to make a split-second decision. In the end, Carmelo was convicted of manslaughter rather than second-degree murder. The court acknowledged the complexities of the case, recognizing that while Carmelo's actions had led to Austin Metcalf's death, they could not definitively prove premeditation. It was a verdict that sparked mixed reactions, relief for some, outrage for others. Carmelo was sentenced to a term in juvenile detention, with the possibility of parole before his 21st birthday. The court also mandated therapy and counseling as part of his rehabilitation, an attempt to address the deeper emotional challenges that may have contributed to his actions. For Carmelo, the road ahead was uncertain. He would have to navigate a system designed to reform but not always equipped to heal the scars of such a traumatic experience. Meanwhile, Austin's family struggled to find closure. For them, no sentence could ever bring back the son, brother, and friend they had lost. They described the verdict as inadequate, and vowed to honor Austin's memory by advocating for stronger measures to prevent violence among youth. The community, too, was left grappling with the aftermath, the case serving as both a cautionary tale and a stark reminder of the fragile line between conflict and tragedy. Anthony was then booked into the Frisco jail, where he remains in custody. A judge has set Anthony's bail at $1 million. As the dust settled on the case, one question remained at the forefront of everyone's minds: where do we draw the line between self-defense and murder? Carmelo's claim was rooted in fear, a primal reaction to what he perceived as a threat. But was his fear justified? Was there an imminent danger, or was it the product of deeper insecurities and unresolved tensions? And even if he believed he was acting in self-defense, does that belief absolve him of the responsibility for taking a life? The courtroom couldn't fully answer these questions, and perhaps no one ever could. Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior, justice, and morality. What makes someone like Carmelo feel so cornered that they turn to violence? How do we, as a society, address the underlying issues, be it mental health, bullying, or unresolved conflict, that lead to such outcomes? And for those like Austin, whose lives are tragically cut short, how do we ensure that their legacy serves as a reminder of the value of empathy, understanding, and compassion? As the legal proceedings drew to a close, the story of Carmelo Anthony and Austin Metcalf remained an open chapter in the hearts of many. It was a story of loss and consequence, one that left behind a community searching for answers, and a hope that such a tragedy would never repeat itself. Story 3. This is the case of James Bernard Johnson. Iowa man who yelled, "Come get high," to a stranger before fatally shooting her after rejection. It was a warm summer evening in Des Moines, Iowa, a night like countless others. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving behind traces of gold that clung faintly to the sky. The city had settled into its familiar rhythms, the chatter of neighbors, the hum of passing cars, and the occasional bark of a restless dog weaving into the tapestry of sound. This was a place where life moved at an unhurried pace, where routines unfolded without interruption and evenings promised calm, not chaos. But on this particular evening, something different would unfold. Something no one could anticipate, and many still struggle to understand. Nikki Lofredo moved through her day as she often did. She was a kind-hearted 30-year-old woman, known by friends and family for her warmth and generosity. Those who knew her would often describe her smile. It wasn't just a smile, they'd say, but a reflection of who she was, open, approachable, and full of life. On this evening, Nikki had no way of knowing that this particular night would be unlike any other. That her path would cross with someone she had never met before. Someone who, in an instant, would change everything. At that very moment, elsewhere in the city, James Bernard Johnson sat behind the wheel of his SUV. The soft purr of the engine was steady, its sound blending into the gentle hum of the quiet streets around him. His vehicle was inconspicuous, just another car in a sea of countless others. Yet, for reasons that might never be fully understood, Johnson's intentions were anything but ordinary. As the minutes ticked by, a decision was forming. A decision that would collide with Nikki's world in an irreversible way. The streetlights flickered to life as darkness blanketed the city. On Southeast 14th Street, the air was quiet, broken only by the occasional whoosh of passing cars. The scene was peaceful, predictable, designed to lull one into a false sense of security. It's in moments like these, when everything feels steady, that the unexpected often happens. James drove, his vehicle casting long shadows as it moved slowly down the dimly lit street. His demeanor was calm, unhurried, perhaps even detached, as he scanned the empty sidewalks. The weight of what was about to happen was yet to reveal itself. To those around him, he would have seemed just another anonymous figure passing through the night. But what took place in the moments that followed would etch his name into headlines, court transcripts, and memories, forever tied to an act that defies explanation. Nikki was there, just going about her evening. She was in the wrong place, at the wrong time, or perhaps it was something much more chilling than mere coincidence. Johnson rolled down his window. The mechanical whir was quiet, but it might as well have been thunder in hindsight. What followed next was a simple phrase, words thrown into the night with no context, no warning. "Come get high," he called out. An invitation? A command? Perhaps neither. What was clear was that Nikki's response, a calm "no," would be the last choice she ever got to make. The moment itself was fleeting, but its impact would reverberate far beyond the quiet street where it unfolded. In an instant, the peace of the evening shattered. There was a sound, a sharp, piercing noise that seemed to hang in the air, lingering longer than it should have. For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath, as if it, too, understood something irreversible had just taken place. And just like that, the night shifted. The quiet harmony of Des Moines, the steady pulse of its small-town normalcy, was gone. All that remained was the echo of a single moment, and the question that would haunt many: why? Nikki Lofredo was the kind of person who left an impression on everyone she met. Born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa, she carried with her the unmistakable warmth of a small-town upbringing. Her friends and family spoke of her as someone who embodied kindness, someone who offered an open hand to anyone in need, regardless of their circumstances. Nikki's life was guided by her unyielding belief that a little compassion could make the world a brighter place. In her early 30s, Nikki had settled into the rhythms of adulthood. She worked as a barista at a local coffee shop, where she greeted customers every morning with a cheerful smile and a knack for remembering their orders. It wasn't just a job for her, it was a way to connect with people, to bring a little joy into their day. She was the type of person who made others feel seen. Whether it was a regular patron seeking comfort in a cup of coffee or a newcomer hesitant about what to order, Nikki had a way of putting people at ease. Outside of work, Nikki devoted much of her time to her community. She volunteered at a nearby shelter, helping those who were less fortunate. For her, it wasn't about recognition or accolades, it was simply the right thing to do. On weekends, she could often be found tending to her small garden or taking long walks through the city's parks, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. She loved the outdoors, the way it allowed her to breathe and reflect on the world around her. Those who knew Nikki described her as a person of boundless empathy. She was someone who listened without judgment, who offered encouragement when times were tough. She believed that people were fundamentally good, that everyone deserved a second chance. That belief was part of who she was, woven into the fabric of her life. It was this same trusting nature that made the events of that fateful evening all the more heartbreaking. On the other hand, James Bernard Johnson's life appeared unremarkable. He was a man in his mid-50s, an Iowa native whose past was a patchwork of ups and downs. Johnson had spent much of his adulthood moving from one job to another, never quite finding stability. Those who knew him described him as a solitary figure, someone who often kept to himself. Johnson's history was marked by struggles, financial difficulties, personal setbacks, and a growing sense of disconnection from the world around him. He had a criminal record that included minor offenses, a trail of bad decisions that hinted at a man teetering on the edge. In the months leading up to the crime, Johnson's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He seemed restless, agitated, as though something unseen was gnawing at him. He lived alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Des Moines, a space that mirrored his isolation. Neighbors rarely saw him, and when they did, their interactions were brief and uneventful. Johnson was not someone who drew attention to himself, he existed on the periphery, unnoticed by most. What little is known about Johnson's mindset on that summer evening comes from the fragments pieced together during the investigation and trial. He had been drinking heavily that night, a habit that had become all too familiar. His actions seemed impulsive, fueled by a combination of alcohol and a simmering frustration that had been building for years. His encounter with Nikki Lofredo was not planned, it was random, a collision of two lives that should never have crossed. The city of Des Moines, nestled in the heart of Iowa, is often seen as a tranquil place. Known for its tree-lined streets and close-knit communities, it's a city where life unfolds at an easy pace. People here take pride in their sense of community, in the belief that neighbors look out for one another. But like any place, it has its complexities, a tapestry of lives intersecting, each carrying its own joys and struggles. The night of July 27, 2024, was calm and unassuming. Southeast 14th Street, like so many streets in Des Moines, bore the quiet marks of familiarity, an evening where the ordinary continued without interruption. It was here, under the soft glow of streetlights and amid the muffled sounds of distant traffic, that Nikki Lofredo unknowingly approached her final moments. She was walking along the sidewalk, her steps unhurried and her posture relaxed. There was no sense of urgency in her movements, no apprehension in her mind. Nikki had no reason to suspect anything unusual. This was, after all, her city, her community, where the days blended seamlessly into nights and security was a given, not a question. Then came the sound, the hum of a slow-moving vehicle creeping along beside her. It was James Bernard Johnson, idling in his SUV as he scanned the street. Nikki's presence caught his attention, pulling his focus to her as if she were the answer to some unspoken thought. He rolled down his window, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Come get high," he said, the words jarring in their abruptness. Nikki stopped briefly, her eyes meeting his as she processed the strange proposition. Her response was simple, direct. "No," she said, her voice calm but resolute. What happened next was swift, a flash of action so unexpected that it left no time for intervention. Johnson reached for a firearm, a calculated decision made in the shadow of impulsivity. He claimed later that his intention had not been to harm, that he had fired at the ground. But the truth, evident in the aftermath, told a different story. The gunshot rang out, sharp and piercing, disrupting the night's tranquility. The sound echoed off nearby buildings, bouncing through the silence like a signal, a call that something terrible had just occurred. Nikki fell to the ground, struck by the bullet that Johnson insisted had been aimed elsewhere. The moments following the gunshot were chaotic yet strangely muted. Johnson did not linger, his SUV disappeared into the night as quickly as it had appeared. Nikki lay on the pavement, her body still and her breathing shallow, as witnesses rushed to her aid. Calls to emergency services were made, voices trembling as they described the unthinkable. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize her. The injuries were severe, the damage profound. Nikki fought with everything she had, her body resisting the darkness that threatened to claim her. But despite their efforts, her condition worsened. 2 days after the shooting, Nikki Lofredo succumbed to her injuries. Her passing sent ripples of grief through the community, a wave of sorrow that touched the lives of those who had known her and those who had only heard of her kindness. She was gone, her life cut short by a senseless act of violence that defied logic or explanation. James Bernard Johnson's actions that night would be scrutinized in the days and weeks to come. His claim of firing at the ground, of not intending harm, would be challenged by the undeniable evidence. The bullet that struck Nikki was not an accident, and the consequences of his decision were now irreversible. For Des Moines, the loss of Nikki Lofredo was more than just a tragedy, it was a reminder of the fragility of life, of the unpredictable nature of human actions. The community mourned her, holding vigils and sharing memories of the woman who had touched so many lives. And as the investigation unfolded, the search for justice began. The investigation began with a single call, a distressed voice on the line with emergency services, reporting a shooting on Southeast 14th Street. Officers arrived swiftly at the scene, the sound of their sirens cutting through the night as they pieced together the aftermath of the tragedy. Nikki Lofredo had already been rushed to the hospital, her condition critical, her chances uncertain. The street bore faint traces of the crime. Shell casings, tire marks, and scattered belongings painted a fragmented picture of what had occurred. Witnesses, though shaken, provided crucial accounts. Some had seen the SUV, its driver's face fleetingly visible as he sped away. Others had heard the chilling exchange, the words, the refusal, and the gunshot that followed. Within hours, detectives were combing through surveillance footage from nearby businesses, their eyes scanning for anything that could identify the suspect. It wasn't long before they found what they were looking for, a grainy image of an SUV passing through an intersection shortly after the time of the shooting. The vehicle's license plate was partially visible, a break in the case that would prove pivotal. James Bernard Johnson was identified as the owner of the vehicle, and by the next day, officers were at his apartment. Johnson did not resist when they arrived. He seemed calm, almost detached, as he was taken into custody. His demeanor was unsettling, as though he had yet to grasp the gravity of his actions. During the search of his residence, investigators uncovered evidence that painted a clearer picture of Johnson's mindset that night. Among the items recovered was his cell phone, its contents revealing text messages sent in the hours leading up to the crime. The messages were erratic, disjointed, laced with references to alcohol and frustration. One in particular stood out, a chilling prelude to the violence that followed. "This city is full of people who think they're better than me. They'll learn." The discovery of the texts became a turning point in the case, establishing intent and contradicting Johnson's later claims that the shooting had been an accident. The weight of the evidence against him was growing, and it was clear that justice for Nicky would rest on the meticulous work of the investigators who had brought him into custody. The trial began months later, a process that would bring Nicky Lofredo's story to the forefront of public attention. The courtroom was filled with somber faces, family members, friends, and community members who had come to support Nicky's loved ones and bear witness to the proceedings. The prosecution laid out a compelling case, presenting the text messages, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence. They argued that James Bernard Johnson's actions were deliberate, that his decision to fire the weapon was not a moment of drunken carelessness but a calculated response to perceived rejection. The defense, in contrast, sought to portray Johnson as a troubled man who had made a terrible mistake. They emphasized his history of alcoholism and mental health struggles, suggesting that his actions were impulsive rather than intentional. Johnson himself took the stand, his testimony a mix of regret and deflection. He admitted to drinking heavily that night, to feeling anger and frustration, but he maintained that the shot had been meant for the ground, not for Nicky. The jury listened intently, their expressions giving little away as the trial unfolded. They heard from experts who analyzed the trajectory of the bullet, from witnesses who recounted the events of that night, and from Nicky's loved ones, whose pain was palpable as they shared their memories of her. After a week of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. James Bernard Johnson was found guilty of second-degree murder, a decision that brought a measure of closure to those who had been waiting for justice. The judge's sentencing reflected the gravity of the crime, ensuring that Johnson would spend decades behind bars. The aftermath of the trial was a time of reflection for Des Moines. The city, known for its quiet charm and sense of safety, had been shaken by the events of that summer night. But amid the grief and anger, there was also a deep sense of solidarity. Community members came together to honor Nicky's memory, holding vigils and fundraisers to support her family. Nicky's legacy became a source of inspiration. Stories of her kindness and generosity spread far beyond the city, touching the hearts of strangers who had never met her but felt connected to her spirit. Her name became synonymous with compassion, a reminder of the good that exists even in the face of tragedy. For the investigators, the trial's conclusion was a testament to the importance of their work. They had pieced together a complex puzzle, ensuring that Nicky's story would not be forgotten and that her killer would be held accountable. And for the people of Des Moines, life slowly began to move forward. The loss of Nicky Lofredo left a void, but her memory endured, a beacon of hope in a world often marked by uncertainty. In the weeks and months following the trial, conversations about the case began to ripple beyond the boundaries of Des Moines. Nicky Lofredo's story became more than just a local tragedy, it became a lens through which many reflected on the broader implications of random violence and the fragility of life. One of the most haunting aspects of Nicky's death was its randomness. She had been going about her evening, an ordinary day that held no signs of danger. The encounter with James Bernard Johnson was not premeditated, it was the product of a chance meeting, a collision of two lives that should never have intersected. This randomness made the crime all the more devastating. It was a reminder that life, no matter how carefully lived, is not immune to the unpredictable actions of others. The case also reignited discussions about the intersection of substance abuse, mental health, and violence. Johnson's history of alcoholism and his erratic behavior in the months leading up to the crime painted a troubling picture. While these factors did not excuse his actions, they raised questions about the resources available to individuals struggling with such issues, and whether intervention at an earlier stage could have prevented the tragedy. For the community of Des Moines, Nikki's legacy became a guiding light. Her kindness, her compassion, and her unwavering belief in the goodness of others inspired countless acts of generosity. Neighbors organized food drives, charity events, and volunteer initiatives in her honor. Her name became synonymous with the values she had embodied in life, a way of ensuring that her spirit would endure even in her absence. Nikki's story also sparked a renewed commitment to safety and vigilance. City officials worked to improve public awareness and resources, encouraging residents to look out for one another. While it could never bring Nikki back, it was a step toward building a community where such a tragedy might be less likely to happen again. And yet, for all the reflections and resolutions, the loss of Nikki Loffredo remained a deep and personal wound for those who had known and loved her. Her family, her friends, and her co-workers carried the weight of her absence every day. But they also carried her memory, the countless moments of joy, kindness, and connection that defined her life. In the end, Nikki's story was one of contrasts, the light she brought to the world and the darkness that took her away. It was a reminder of the fragility of life but also of the enduring impact one person can have on countless others. And as her community continued to tell her story, they ensured that she would never be forgotten. Story 4. This is the case of Charlene Rosemond, who tragically lost her life after being lured to a parking lot by someone she trusted. There are stories that unfold in the quiet corners of ordinary lives, where trust is built brick by brick. Stories of friendships that promise unwavering support, laughter shared, and secrets kept safe. These stories often shine brightly, like the warm glow of a streetlight cutting through the night. But sometimes, within that very glow, shadows begin to stretch longer than they should. Charlene Rosemond was like many others, a young woman full of dreams and excitement, looking forward to a brighter tomorrow. Her father's love and encouragement drove her toward finding independence, and among the milestones she was eager to reach was owning a car she could call her own, a step toward freedom, toward growing up, toward carving her path. It was something she had planned, something she had been waiting for, with a little help from a trusted friend. And that friend, Roberto Jeune, seemed just as ready to stand by her side, promising to help her make that dream a reality. The two met under familiar skies, in a setting that held no hint of threat. The parking lot where Charlene was to take the final step toward her dream. A Lexus, sleek and waiting, a vision she had anticipated for weeks. Roberto was there, as expected. The scene was calm, ordinary, even routine. The kind of scenario that plays out in countless lives without incident, without consequence. But as time ticked by, the ordinary gave way to something far more unnerving. Choices were made in that moment, choices whose echoes would ripple across days, years, lives. From a place of trust and familiarity, a sequence of events was set into motion, events that led to a tragic and unimaginable end. For Charlene Rosemond, it should have been a moment of celebration. But instead, what waited for her in the parking lot was a step into the unknown, an unknown that would leave scars no one could anticipate, no one could reverse. And as the details of this case unfold, as the pieces are carefully placed together, one question rises to the surface: how could trust, built over years, lead here. Charlene Rosemond grew up surrounded by the love and support of her family. A young woman with aspirations bigger than her years, she was described by those who knew her as ambitious, bright, and full of life. She carried herself with an energy that hinted at a hunger for independence, a desire to carve out her own path. For Charlene, independence wasn't just a vague concept, it was a series of steps, deliberate and calculated. One of those steps was buying a car. A car represented more than transportation, it was a symbol of freedom. Her father had always encouraged her to chase her dreams and stand on her own 2 feet. When the opportunity arose to purchase a Lexus, a sleek, elegant vehicle that seemed to embody everything Charlene aspired to, she couldn't contain her excitement. It felt like a milestone moment, a tangible sign of progress in her life. The car was more than just a purchase, it was a statement of who she was becoming. In her pursuit of this goal, Charlene turned to someone she considered a trusted ally, Roberto Jun. Roberto wasn't just a casual acquaintance, he was a close friend, someone who had been a part of her life for years. Their relationship was built on familiarity and trust, the kind of bond that often develops naturally over time. To Charlene, Roberto wasn't just a friend, he was someone she believed she could rely on. So when Roberto offered to help her buy the car, she saw it as an extension of that trust, a gesture of friendship. But Roberto Jun was not alone in this story. Behind the scenes, another name would later emerge, Heinzkai Anacreon. Unlike Roberto, Heinzkai was not someone Charlene knew well, if at all. His role in the unfolding events remained shadowy, but his presence would later cast a long and chilling shadow over the case. Together, Roberto and Heinzkai would become central figures in a story that was anything but ordinary. The plan seemed simple. Roberto told Charlene about a Lexus she could buy, a car that fit both her budget and her aspirations. The details were arranged, a meeting in a parking lot where the transaction would take place. To Charlene, it must have felt like the culmination of weeks of anticipation. She trusted Roberto, and there was no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. The location, the timing, the circumstances, all of it seemed routine. On the day of the meeting, Charlene arrived at the parking lot. It was an ordinary setting, the kind of place where countless similar transactions occur without incident. The anticipation of finally seeing the car, of taking that next step in her journey, must have been palpable for her. She wasn't alone, Roberto was there, just as he had promised. The scene was calm, unassuming, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the moments unfolded, the calm facade began to give way. What happened next would shatter the trust Charlene had placed in Roberto and would leave her family and friends grappling with the unthinkable. The parking lot, which should have been the setting for a joyful milestone, became the site of a tragedy. Charlene never made it home that day. The car she had dreamed of owning, the independence she had worked so hard to achieve, were lost in a matter of moments. Her life, filled with promise and potential, came to a sudden and violent end. For Charlene's loved ones, the events of that day would raise questions that would haunt them for years. How could something so ordinary turn so devastating? How could someone she trusted play a role in her demise? Hours passed after Charlene left her home that day, leaving her family in growing concern. She was not someone to disappear without notice, especially given the anticipation she had shared about meeting Roberto and seeing the car she dreamed of owning. Her father, knowing her habits and routines, sensed something was wrong. When she did not return as expected, the feeling of dread began to settle in, a father's instinct warning him of what he desperately hoped wasn't true. The realization of her absence led to action. Calls were made, searches began, but every lead seemed to end with silence. It was in this unsettling quiet that a horrifying discovery was made. Charlene's body was found inside her father's car. The vehicle, once a tool of daily life, now became an unexpected witness to tragedy. Charlene's lifeless form lay within, a gunshot wound to her head, leaving no question as to how her life had been taken. The scene was devastating, a stark and unthinkable contrast to the dreams she had nurtured. For investigators, the crime scene raised more questions than answers. Why had Charlene been inside her father's car, away from the parking lot where she was meant to meet Roberto? How had her life come to such an abrupt and violent end? The questions pressed against the minds of those tasked with uncovering the truth, but the answers were not immediately forthcoming. The case, despite its urgency, quickly grew cold. Years passed with no resolution. The pain of Charlene's family deepened as the absence of answers became harder to bear. Investigators faced mounting challenges, pieces of evidence that felt incomplete, witnesses who seemed unwilling or unable to shed light on the events of that day. The passage of time, instead of bringing clarity, seemed to bury the truth beneath layers of doubt and uncertainty. Charlene's life, her dreams, her future, all of it remained suspended in the tragedy of that discovery. Yet, as with many cold cases, there often comes a moment where the threads of time begin to loosen, revealing something that had been hidden. For Charlene's case, that moment arrived years later, bringing with it a name that had lingered on the edges of suspicion: Heinskei Anakrian. His arrest marked a turning point, a step toward uncovering what had truly happened. Details of the evidence began to emerge, a pattern of actions and connections that pointed to his involvement in the crime. The indictment of Heinskei Anakrian gave investigators a new focus. Evidence suggested that he had been involved in Charlene's death, working alongside Roberto Jun. Questions about motive swirled, pulling together fragments of the story that had once seemed unconnected. Why had these men, particularly Roberto, someone Charlene trusted, betrayed her in such a devastating way? What could possibly explain the choices that led to her death? Theories began to surface, each attempting to make sense of the incomprehensible. Some suggested that financial motives had played a role, a plan gone wrong, an attempt to exploit Charlene's trust for personal gain. Others speculated that the betrayal stemmed from deeper, darker reasons, an emotional rift, jealousy, or unresolved tensions. Roberto's role in the events remained central to every theory, as investigators worked to piece together his relationship with Charlene and how it could have led to such a tragic outcome. As the story unfolded, Heinskei Anakrian's actions came under increasing scrutiny. His connection to Roberto and their alleged collaboration painted a picture of premeditation, a plan that had been carefully crafted, yet ended in chaos and loss. Charlene's case, once cold and stagnant, began to regain momentum, fueled by the determination of those who sought justice for her. But even with this progress, the lingering question remained: how could trust, so carefully built, result in betrayal so complete? In the years following Charlene Roseman's tragic death, her family's grief never truly lessened. The discovery of her body, the unanswered questions, and the haunting silence that followed became an indelible part of their lives. For her father, the car that had once been a symbol of routine and reliability became a painful reminder of what had been lost. Each passing day without justice felt like a weight, compounding the sorrow of losing a beloved daughter. The eventual arrest of Heinskei Anakrian brought some semblance of hope, a sign that the truth might finally emerge. Investigators presented evidence linking Heinskei to the crime, pointing to his alleged involvement alongside Roberto Jun. The legal proceedings began, offering Charlene's family the chance to see those responsible held accountable. Yet, the path to justice was fraught with complexities. Cases like Charlene's often involve layers of legal challenges, moments of uncertainty, and the agonizing wait for resolution. For Charlene's loved ones, attending court hearings meant reliving the worst days of their lives. It meant hearing the details of what had transpired in that parking lot, piecing together the fragmented story of her final moments. Each appearance, each testimony, each revelation in the courtroom brought flashes of anger, heartbreak, and longing for closure. Yet, despite these challenges, her family remained steadfast, determined to honor Charlene's memory by seeking accountability for those who had betrayed her trust. The legal proceedings against Roberto Jun and Heinz Anacreon marked a significant shift in the case, but the answers provided still felt incomplete. What could drive someone, a trusted friend, to commit such an act? What motivated Heinz's alleged involvement? These questions lingered, serving as reminders of the complexities of human behavior and the fragile nature of trust. As the case continued to unfold, reflections on Charlene's life became a central theme for those who loved her. Her ambitions, her laughter, her dreams, these were the things they chose to hold on to, preserving her memory as a source of strength. For her father, every story shared about her, every photograph revisited, every memory exchanged was a way to keep her spirit alive in a world that had been forever changed. Charlene's story also became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of vigilance, even in the most familiar relationships. Trust is a cornerstone of human connection, yet its vulnerability lies in its potential for exploitation. Her case illustrated the devastating consequences of misplaced trust, urging others to tread carefully in their own lives. For viewers, this reflection served as an invitation to consider the value of intuition, awareness, and self-protection. At the heart of these reflections is a universal truth: betrayal carries a weight that extends far beyond the act itself. It fractures relationships, shakes foundations, and leaves echoes that are felt across time and space. And yet, there is also a profound resilience in those who endure such betrayal, a determination to find meaning, to seek justice, to rebuild in the face of loss. As the documentary draws to a close, I'm inviting you to pause and reflect on the story you've heard. Charlene Roseman's life was filled with promise, and though her journey ended in tragedy, her story continues to resonate as a reminder of the complexities of trust, the importance of vigilance, and the enduring strength of love. Story 5. Man arrested for strangling his wife to death and dumping her body in Mexico after a job interview. Jorge Mares Regoza was an ordinary man by most accounts. A husband, a father, a man navigating the challenges of life like so many others. But on a seemingly unremarkable day, his life took a turn that no one could have foreseen. It was a day that began with the promise of opportunity, a job interview that could have been a step toward a brighter future. Yet, by the time the sun set, the world would come to know his name for reasons far removed from ambition or success. Coral Lamas Cifuentes, his wife, was a woman with her own story, her own dreams, and her own struggles. Together, they had built a life, weathered storms, and shared moments of joy. But beneath the surface of their shared existence lay tensions, secrets, and emotions that neither could fully articulate. What happened that day? What led Jorge to make a choice so devastating, so irreversible? The answers lie in the fragments of their lives, in the moments that preceded the tragedy, and in the aftermath that would unravel a web of betrayal, rage, and consequence. This is not just a story of a crime. It is a story of human frailty, of the choices we make, and the paths we take when faced with the unthinkable. Underneath the calm exterior of their shared lives lay the intricate tapestry of Jorge Mares Regoza and Coral Lamas Cifuentes' relationship, a story of love, tension, and the shifting dynamics that bind two people together. Their lives, while outwardly unremarkable, held the quiet complexities that so many relationships do. Jorge, a man defined by routine and responsibility, had built his world around stability. He was steadfast, perhaps to a fault, relying on predictability as a foundation in an ever-changing world. Coral, on the other hand, possessed a contrasting energy. Vibrant and expressive, she carried with her a spirit that seemed to yearn for more adventure, more attention, more meaning. Together, their differences had once complemented each other, creating a balance that worked, at least for a time. They lived in a modest home, nestled in the border town's suburbs. It was not extraordinary by any means, but it was theirs, a symbol of the life they had built together. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with the hum of neighbors going about their daily lives. Their home bore the marks of their shared history, photographs on the walls documenting milestones, the faint imprint of children's laughter echoing in the hallways, and the quiet moments of connection that happen when no one else is watching. Family was important to both of them, though the way they expressed it differed. Coral's warmth extended effortlessly, creating connections with friends and loved ones, while Jorge's reserved nature manifested in quiet acts of service, fixing what needed repair, ensuring the bills were paid, and working tirelessly to provide. Their children were their shared pride, a connection that kept them tethered even as other parts of their relationship strained under the pressures of life. And yet, despite the life they had built, something began to shift between them. The small cracks, at first imperceptible, started to widen. The demands of daily life, compounded by the challenges of raising a family, took their toll. Misunderstandings became more frequent, and moments of silence began to stretch longer than either had intended. They were still together, but the connection they had once cherished was fraying at the edges. It was during this fragile phase of their marriage that Jorge discovered something that would change everything. A message left open on Coral's phone, casual enough in its phrasing but unmistakable in its implication, hinted at an affair. The words were like a sudden gust of wind, knocking the air from his chest and leaving him reeling. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the betrayal, the realization that there were parts of Coral's life he no longer recognized, that the woman he thought he knew so well had secrets of her own. Jorge's reaction was one of quiet devastation. He didn't confront her immediately, that wasn't his way. Instead, he sat with the knowledge, letting it sink in and fester. Questions flooded his mind, each one more painful than the last. How long had this been going on? Was there something he could have done to prevent it? And most hauntingly, had Coral ever truly loved him, or was their life together just a carefully constructed facade? Coral, perhaps sensing a shift in Jorge's demeanor, tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. She was adept at masking her emotions, at least outwardly, but even she couldn't fully hide the tension that now defined their interactions. The once small cracks in their relationship had become chasms, and every shared glance, every exchanged word seemed to carry the weight of unspoken truths. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere in their home grew heavier. Jorge's silence, once a source of comfort, now felt ominous. Coral, for her part, alternated between moments of defiance and attempts at reconciliation, unsure of how much Jorge truly knew and struggling with her own emotions. The delicate balance of their lives had been upended, and neither of them seemed capable of finding solid ground. This was not a story of villains or heroes, but of two flawed individuals caught in a web of their own making. Jorge's world was defined by his need for control, and Coral's by her longing for freedom. Together, these opposing forces had created a volatile dynamic, one that could no longer be ignored. As their relationship unraveled, so too did the carefully constructed image of their life together. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a prison, each room holding memories that were both cherished and haunting. The laughter of their children, once a source of joy, now served as a painful reminder of what was at stake. The day began like any other, with the quiet hum of routine filling the air. Jorge Mares Regoza had woken early, his mind preoccupied with the job interview that awaited him. It was an opportunity he had been preparing for, a chance to bring some stability back into his life. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that would soon engulf everything he had known. Coral Llama Cifuentes was in the kitchen, her movements deliberate yet distant. The tension between them had become almost tangible in recent weeks, an unspoken weight that neither could ignore. Jorge had spent countless nights replaying the discovery of her affair in his mind, the betrayal cutting deeper with each passing day. He had tried to suppress his emotions, to focus on the practicalities of life, but the pain was relentless. As the morning unfolded, Jorge found himself unable to contain the turmoil within him any longer. He approached Coral, his voice steady but laced with an intensity that betrayed his inner struggle. The confrontation was inevitable, a moment that had been building for weeks. He asked her about the messages, about the man whose name he could barely bring himself to utter. Coral, caught off guard, hesitated before responding. Her words were measured, an attempt to defuse the situation, but they only served to fan the flames of Jorge's anger. The conversation escalated, emotions running high as years of unspoken grievances came to the surface. Jorge's voice grew louder, his words sharper, as he demanded answers. Coral, for her part, tried to maintain her composure, but the cracks in her facade began to show. The argument reached a crescendo, a moment of raw, unfiltered emotion that left both of them reeling. In the heat of the moment, something within Jorge snapped. The weight of his emotions, the betrayal, the anger, it all became too much to bear. What happened next was a blur, a series of actions driven by a storm of feelings he could no longer control. When it was over, the reality of what he had done began to sink in. Coral was gone, her lifeless form a stark reminder of the irreversible choice he had made. Jorge stood there, his mind racing as he tried to comprehend the magnitude of his actions. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt suffocating, the walls closing in around him. He knew he had to act, to find a way to cover his tracks, but the enormity of the situation left him paralyzed. And yet, amidst the chaos, Jorge made a decision that would later baffle investigators and those who heard his story. He chose to proceed with his job interview, as if clinging to a semblance of normalcy in the face of unimaginable circumstances. He left the house, his demeanor calm and composed, and attended the interview as planned. To those who interacted with him that day, he appeared unremarkable, a man focused on securing a better future. But beneath the surface, Jorge was anything but composed. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more troubling than the last. He knew he couldn't leave Coral's body in the house, that he had to find a way to dispose of it. After the interview, he returned home and began the grim task of covering his tracks. He placed her body in his vehicle and drove across the border into Mexico, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with every mile. The journey was long and fraught with tension, each passing moment a reminder of the irreversible choice he had made. Jorge eventually found a remote location, a place where he believed no one would find her. He left her there, the act both a final goodbye and an attempt to distance himself from the crime. As he drove back, the reality of what he had done began to settle in. The life he had known was over, replaced by a new existence defined by guilt, fear, and the knowledge that he could never undo what had been done. Jorge returned home, his mind racing as he tried to piece together a story that would explain Coral's absence. But the truth, as it often does, had a way of revealing itself. The investigation that followed would uncover the details of Jorge's actions, the evidence painting a picture of a man pushed to his breaking point. But for those who knew him, the question remained, how could someone so seemingly ordinary commit such an extraordinary act? It was a question that would linger long after the case was closed, a reminder of the complexities of the human condition. The investigation into the disappearance of Coral Llama Cifuentes began quietly but quickly evolved into a complex and international effort. Initially, her absence raised concern among her loved ones. Coral had always been dependable, balancing her responsibilities as a mother with her own ambitions, so the sudden silence from her side felt alarming. Friends and family began reaching out, hoping for any sign of her, but as hours turned into days, the worry intensified. When Coral was officially reported missing, the El Paso Police Department opened an investigation. Officers began tracing her last known movements and contacting those closest to her, including her husband, Jorge Mares Regoza. Jorge's initial statement was simple yet vague. He claimed Coral had left the house on her own and had not returned. For a while, it seemed plausible, there were no immediate signs of foul play, and Jorge's demeanor remained calm and cooperative. But that calm would soon unravel as investigators began piecing together evidence. One of the first breakthroughs came when detectives obtained surveillance footage from multiple locations near the family's home and around the border. In the footage, Jorge's vehicle could be seen heading toward Mexico, carrying something concealed in the back, a sight that raised immediate suspicion. While there was no direct evidence at this stage, the timing of the journey aligned ominously with Coral's disappearance. The investigators knew that this was a vital lead. Crossing international borders complicated the case, as it introduced jurisdictional challenges and required coordination with foreign authorities. The FBI, recognizing the gravity of the situation, joined the effort to assist with the cross-border aspect of the investigation. Several days after Coral's disappearance, authorities in Mexico made a grim discovery. Coral's body was found in a remote location, far from any major thoroughfare. The condition of the scene suggested an attempt to hide the crime, but the evidence left behind told a different story. Forensic experts collected samples, examined the area, and began building a profile of what had happened. Through cooperative efforts between the FBI and Mexican authorities, the discovery was quickly connected back to the ongoing investigation in El Paso. By this point, suspicions about Jorge had solidified, and investigators were honing in on him as the primary suspect. Confronted with mounting evidence, Jorge eventually broke under pressure during a series of interviews with law enforcement. His confession, though disjointed, provided critical details about the events leading up to Coral's death. He admitted to the confrontation, to the act of strangling her in a fit of anger, and to the calculated decisions he made afterward, from attending his job interview to disposing of her body across the border. The confession was chilling in its specificity, revealing not only Jorge's actions but also his state of mind in the hours following the crime. Yet, even with his admission, investigators worked meticulously to corroborate every detail. They knew that building a watertight case would be essential in securing justice for Coral and her family. Navigating the international aspects of the case proved to be a significant challenge. While Mexican authorities were cooperative, logistical hurdles, language barriers, and differences in legal procedures added layers of complexity. Evidence had to be transported securely, witnesses interviewed across borders, and cultural sensitivities considered. Yet, despite these obstacles, the collaboration between the FBI, El Paso Police Department, and Mexican officials was successful in ensuring that every piece of evidence was accounted for. The investigation culminated in Jorge's arrest, a moment that brought both relief and heartbreak to those who had been following the case. For Coral's loved ones, the resolution of the investigation was bittersweet, a step toward justice, but one that could never undo the loss they had suffered. The tragic case of Coral Lamas Cifuentes left behind ripples that touched many lives in its wake. A woman full of dreams and the promise of a future was gone, her life cut short in a manner incomprehensible to those who loved her. For her family and friends, the shock of her death was matched only by the weight of grief that followed. Coral was a daughter, a mother, and a friend, roles that carried meaning and memories for countless individuals. Her absence would forever leave an empty space in the lives of those who knew her best. Jorge Mares Regos's actions, too, brought consequences that extended far beyond his own life. The man who had once been seen as dependable and reserved was now known for an unimaginable act, a decision rooted in emotions that many struggled to understand. In confessing to the crime, Jorge shed light on the sequence of events, but his admission left questions unanswered. How could he have let his emotions guide him to such a devastating act? What had prevented him from finding another path, one that did not end in loss and suffering? For Coral's family, the answers to these questions were unlikely to bring solace. They grappled with the heartbreak of losing her, compounded by the knowledge that her life ended at the hands of someone she had trusted. The days that followed were filled with sorrow and reflection, as loved ones sought to preserve her memory through the stories and moments they had shared. The grief was heavy, but through it all, Coral's family demonstrated resilience, a determination to honor her life, even in the face of tragedy. The community, too, felt the reverberations of the case. For those who had known Jorge and Coral, the revelation of what had transpired was difficult to process. Conversations turned to the complexities of human relationships, the hidden struggles that exist behind closed doors, and the emotions that can lead individuals to unthinkable choices. The case was a reminder that tragedy often stems from deeply rooted issues that, if addressed, might prevent such outcomes. This leads to profound and uncomfortable questions. What drives someone to commit an act so final, so devastating? Is it a momentary lapse, fueled by anger and betrayal? Or is it the culmination of years of unspoken tension, a breaking point that was ignored until it was too late? And perhaps the hardest question of all, could this tragedy have been prevented? Could words spoken earlier, support offered sooner, or intervention at the right moment have changed the trajectory of Jorge and Coral's story? These are questions that do not have easy answers, yet they demand reflection. They challenge us to look at the ways we connect with one another, the importance of open communication, and the need to address emotions and conflicts before they grow beyond control. The case of Coral and Jorge reminds us that behind every tragedy lies a series of decisions and missed opportunities, moments that could have steered the narrative toward a different, more hopeful ending. As the investigation concluded and Jorge faced the consequences of his actions, there was a sense of bittersweet closure. Justice, though served, could not undo what had been done. Coral's family had some answers, but the void left by her absence would remain. Jorge, now defined by his actions, was left to contend with the weight of his choices. He had lost his family, his future, and, most of all, his sense of self. The man he had been was gone, replaced by the shadow of what he had done. For those hearing this story, there is a deeper lesson to be found, a call to acknowledge the complexities of human relationships, to seek understanding and empathy even in the midst of conflict, and to recognize the value of intervention when emotions run high. It is a reminder that tragedy does not happen in isolation, it is the result of interconnected moments, choices, and feelings that converge in ways we may never fully comprehend. And so, as we close the chapter on this story, we are left with the memory of Coral, a woman whose life had meaning, whose dreams held promise, and whose story, though tragic, serves as a reminder to cherish those we hold dear. May her memory inspire us to listen, to connect, and to find resolution in the moments that challenge us the most. In her name, may we strive to prevent the unthinkable and foster a world where understanding prevails. Thank you for spending this time with me and for allowing these 5 disturbing stories to echo in your thoughts tonight. Stories like this serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of trust and the enduring strength of those who seek justice in its wake. If you found this story compelling, I invite you to join our growing community by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Together, we can continue to explore these tales of resilience, reflection, and the human spirit. As you settle into rest tonight, let the calm settle over you. Our background sounds will carry you into tranquility as you drift toward sleep. Thank you for being here, and until next time, stay safe and take care.